Before we start our discussion about properties, I want you to think of properties you've learned in the past. Go ahead and stop the video right now and just write down a list of them. When you have a few written down, come on back. So hopefully you remembered the commutative property. And the commutative property can be used when you want to change the order. So it's only used for addition and multiplication. So you change the order when you're adding or multiplying. Then we have the identity property. The identity property is also for addition. When you take a number and you add 0 to it, you get the same number. And for multiplication, when you multiply a number by 1, you get the same number. You may not have had these listed in the exact same order. That's okay. We have our inverse property. The inverse property is when you add the opposite, and you get 0. So 3 plus -3, for an example, they give you 0. For multiplication, what you're doing is you're multiplying by an inverse. And another word for multiplying by an inverse is the reciprocal. So if I had 3, the reciprocal would be 1 over 3, and when I multiply them, I get 1. If I had 4 over 3, the reciprocal of that is 3 over 4, and I get 1. Another property, hopefully you wrote down, was the associative. And a lot of time we talk about that as our grouping property, where we can group things together. So in here, they're in the same order. Remember, commutative is when we change order, CO for change order. But the associative, see how it's A, B, and C? They stay in the same order, A, B, and C, but we group them different. And it's also good for addition. Look at that, means to multiply, and multiplication. Remember, when we put 2 letters next to each other, we're multiplying. Okay. And then we've worked with the distributive property this year, right? You distribute to each part that's in there. So those are properties that you may have learned in the past. Now we're going to tie them to equations and inequalities. So you know how to solve this equation. But there is a reason why you're allowed to do each step. So as we did, we would put our little line, and then we added 3 to both sides. And the reason you're allowed to add something to both sides is this property of equality called the addition property, I'm just going to write prop there, of equality. What you do to one side, you do to the other. And it's the same thing. If I simplify this more, and I'm dividing by 4, I get x equals 3. And we're allowed to do that by the division property of equality. And there's a multiplication property of equality, and there's a subtraction property of equality. What we want to do is use these properties for our inequalities. So we have these properties of inequalities. And basically, it's just like the properties of equality, only we do them with our inequalities. And it can be done for any of the inequalities. So basically, if you add something to both sides, you're allowed to do that for the addition property of inequality. If you subtract something, you can do that from the subtraction property of inequality. Multiplying by the multiplication property of inequality, and division. So you do them exactly the same. So we introduce these now because we want to do some basic geometric proofs. This is an honors topic. And what happens with the proof is on the left-hand side here, you're given a statement. So you do proofs in geometry. So if you have any older siblings, you can tell them that you did proofs. These are very basic, but still the whole concept of the statement and the property, or sometimes they'll call it the reason. So you'll always start out with a given. And you'll notice here, I don't have each step here, so you ask yourself, what's changed? So as we can see from here to here, oh, we used our distributive property. We used our distributive property. Then we look here and we say, okay, from here to here, what's changed? Well, this seemed to go over. Oh, and you can fill it in if you want, because sometimes when you do that, it reminds you. So I added 12, and that is by my addition property of inequality. Now I look and I'm like, well, on what happened here? Well, I would say minus 5w minus 5w. So I use my subtraction property of inequality. So these are the reasons you're allowed to do the steps you've done. And then at the end, we divided. Remember, when you divide by a negative, change the sign. And that would be my division property of inequality. Now, there is a practice. I want you to go through it and see if you can figure it out and go back to the properties that we have, and then come back and check your answers on here. So you can stop the video and then go check. So the first step was the distributive property. And we used distributive because we did the 5 here. Then you notice, wait, we put a grouping in here. You're allowed to do that with your associative. I want to put groups together, associative property. Then you noticed here, this is all we did. And that's called combining like terms. Maybe you weren't quite sure what to put there, but that's what happened there. And then you noticed here we added 23 to both sides. So hopefully you had the addition property of inequality. Oh, look, we're doing a group together. We're doing a group. We put these together. So this would be the associative property. And then if we look at the next step, like this stayed the same. We added the opposite. When you add the opposite, that's the inverse. And we do like to say the operation of addition. And then, oh, these stayed the same, but the 0 went away. Oh, that's the identity of addition. And then from here, oh, right, we combined our like terms. And this, oh, sorry about that, you couldn't really read that. But the last step was dividing. And that would be the division property of inequality. So now there's a worksheet. It just says one additional practice for you to work on.